the discovery of Uranus, which occurred on March 13th, 1781. Awakening of a new age. I'm bringing this video to you because my good friend and I, Koji Behara, have long been discussing and sharing insights about the discovery charts of planets. And it's a very core feature of astrology. And it's all based on the principles of synchronicity as to when a planet is discovered. We cast a chart for that day and the moment and the location from where it was located or discovered, I should say. And that provides us with this means of insight into the nature of the planet itself and into the whole purpose of its existence in terms of our life on the planet. It's an interpretive approach, but it offers insights about what, for example, the discovery of Uranus in the collective awareness and mind of humanity means and what it has done for us since it was discovered, and where we are now with it. So I thought I would share this with you on this rather special day, which today happens to be spring equinox and 2024. Technically, it's the 20th of March. People were celebrating yesterday, March 19th, which is very understandable because, technically the sun did enter Aries yesterday, March 19th, and that's true of the East in the world, but not everywhere in the world. For one, did it occur. And secondly, here in the West, it only occurred in the evening. So we didn't experience the morning of the day of spring equinox until today, the 20th. So I thought it would be an appropriate time to share these insights with you. And so let's just dive in here and have a closer look at what the actual, chart looks like. But first, a little reminder that Western astrology and astrology in general is associated with synchronicity, which is the meaningful coincidence factor versus the merely causation or random chance perspective of the materialistic model. So Carl Jung, the great psychologist, referred to it as an acausal principle, meaning it has meaning in it, which is what astrology is all about. In his famous phrase, "an ever-present reality for those who have the eyes to see," because he wasn't theorizing, he was observing. He was a true scientist in that regard. It wasn't based on belief or mere hearsay. Now, the fact is that first thing you want to do when it comes to the discovery of a planet is look at what was going on at the time. It gives us the first clue. So I'm going to do that very briefly before we look at the chart itself. Okay, so it was March 13th, 1781. So we're just past the actual birthday, shall we say, of the discovery of Uranus, but some centuries ago, 242 years or so ago. And now, one of the most obvious things that was occurring at that time was the American Revolution. And Uranus has been given as rulership of the modern day ruler of Aquarius in Western astrology, the sign of revolutions. The sign and the planet together go hand in hand in an archetypal principle sense, and they represent the democratic notion versus the that of history where we have kings and queens and monarchs and oligarchies, which in a feudal system, which was true up until that time, where lords of the land and so forth exercise far too much power and authority over the people, sort of a form of social tyranny as the main notion. So the rise of democracy and constitutional law and so forth is very significantly associated with Aquarius, and the planet Uranus, which celebrates individuality and freedom and the rights of the individual as, souls incarnate to have reason to live their life according to their own free will and not to be dictated to by tyrannical forces. And that's been an issue throughout history. And some may think of it as the natural order, but I think it's antithetical to the evolution of the, human race uh, in terms of the dignity of individuality. Individuality and individualism can go too far. We don't want to go to the opposite extreme of dismissing the collective focus, purpose, and need, so anything can get out of balance, but we need to honor both the individual and the collective, which is what Aquarius and Uranus are all about. So the American Revolution was very much about that. And sure enough, over the course of 1775 to 1783, that 8-year period was the duration of the War of Independence, the American Revolution, which coincided very much with the discovery of Uranus in 1781. And in that very year, there was two very important decisive victories, both in North Carolina, at what's called Cowpens, and Utah, North Carolina, where the rebel forces defeated the British, and that led to continued successes. It's emboldened and the rebels to continue on, and they did, and the rest is history, as the saying goes. Now, another important event that occurred right in the context of the discovery of Uranus a couple of years earlier was a book by David Hume called The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And it's kind of a story more than anything, where three philosophers, Greek philosophers, are debating about the nature of God, and all agreeing that there is a God, and that by virtue of intelligent design in particular, but they disagreed on the nature of God. So it's all part of this theme of the scientific revolution giving rise to the Age of Enlightenment, which was to break free of the dogmatic yoke of the Roman Catholic Church at that time, which of course had been diminishing progressively over decades by this time, and going back, as early as the 17th century. So by the 18th century here, it was very, very, very active, and people were very much emboldened again by the scientific revolution. So revolution was in the air everywhere when Uranus was discovered. Now, also in the United States, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences was founded in 1780 over in Boston, Massachusetts, which, the key phrase for that was that it was chartered to cultivate every art and science which may tend to advance the interest, honor, dignity, and happiness of a free, independent, and virtuous people. So it was very much celebrating that very theme of democratic rights and freedoms for people, and not to be subject to the whims of monarchs and oligarchs and tyranny in general. Another book called The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant in 1781 exactly aimed to reach a decision about the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics independent of all experience. The importance of that statement was that, in effect, it was the motion towards removing the subjective experiencer from the whole equation, which has subsequently been overthrown thanks to Albert Einstein, as with the understanding that you can't actually remove the observer from the experiment. He was more probably the popular voice of deeper investigations made specifically by quantum physicists. But it was he was very much involved with the branching of physics into a quantum physics arena. And that was one of the main turning points. So but it was important in the day to kind of aspire, according to Kant's and synchronizing with Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, to uh, break free of the notion of this subjective perspective and to endeavor to experience an objective as opposed to a subjective perspective on reality, which is doable to a certain point, but ultimately it can't be done. So that's an interesting whole backdrop. Now, there was also the Bank of North America that was also right in 1781 established, which was the first de facto chartered central bank in the United States, which was actually, in the most positive sense, gave a lot of leverage to Americans to kind of be able to work with banks. And so it was kind of a high side of banks, okay, which remains true to this day in many respects, but there's, a darker story at worst behind banks and in interest rates and just things like that, and that countries and nations owe great debts to private banks. That's the whole kind of dark side of that. But finally, the French Revolution, which did occur some years later in February of 1787, was kind of historically where it really started, and it was inspired by the American Revolution, and specifically the storming of the Bastille, which is the big day, Bastille Day, in 1789. But all of these very significant historical events, which are pivotal to our modern times, actually occurred within the context of the discovery of Uranus back there in 1781. Now we're going to look at the chart and in a moment, but this is the breakdown. We're going to look at what's called, just to kind of give you a little insight into looking at charts, the chart signature, which is in this case Pisces, the sub-signature Aquarius. That's where you look at the sum total of all the points in the chart, and it comes to a certain sign. And there can be a main chart signature, then a sub-signature, as I'm showing you. Then we'll see that the sun was in Pisces at 2344, the moon in Scorpio, both water signs. Quite significant that the two luminaries were in water. There was a fixed cross, which is a very strong force, with Scorpio on the ascendant and Leo on the midheaven, which I'll explain more fully. The planet of highest elevation was Neptune, the planet that rules Pisces, in Libra. I'll elaborate upon that. The planet of lowest degree, Venus, at 2 degrees Pisces, 53. The planet of highest degree, Jupiter, also in water sign Scorpio. So we have a lot of water here. The lunar north node in Taurus, which is interesting because the south node would be Scorpio. And whenever the north node's in Taurus, it's all about building upon new turf, new ground, new foundations. Pluto at the apex of a T-square to the lunar nodes is a very interesting feature of the whole chart. The sun at the apex of a T-square as well, with a Mars-Saturn opposition to the Uranus in Gemini. T-squares are very dynamic, so I'm going to illustrate this to you in a moment. And finally, the main thing is that the moon and Mercury were both, and Mercury specifically in Aries, were both unaspected. So that was the linear breakdown of this chart, okay? So we're looking at the discovery of Uranus, March 13, 1781, in Bath, England. And we have a time of approximately 10:23 in the afternoon. And what this chart is showing you rather significantly is a lot of the Scorpio factor on the ascendant with the south node, the moon, and Jupiter, and very concentrated theme of water past. Scorpio, it just so happens, can be described as the sign of elite, the elite kind of hidden power. So it's kind of showing how that was a move away, especially from a monarchic perspective, monarchies that had been reigning for so long in history. And, with the North Node in Taurus conjunct Chiron, symbolic of new foundations and need to heal from that probably invariably corrupt situation that people were dealing with monarchs having more power over people than is really healthy for the human spirit, is a good, I think, way to say it. Now, it is worth mentioning that the moon is unaspected, as we briefly mentioned there, in the first house. So that would show, a lot of reaction from the establishment. But interestingly enough, on the house cusp of Scorpio is Gemini, which is ruled by Mercury. And Mercury itself is therefore playing a key role in association with the sign placement of the moon, is itself unaspected in Aries. So what that generally means is that the old guard was left without much leverage or power or opportunity to really resist the forces of change that the planet Uranus was synchronizing with. I'm not suggesting the word cause. Okay, that's an important thing to understand. Planets don't strictly cause the events, they synchronize. There's a meaningful coinciding. And that's a bit of a hard concept for some people to understand, especially when those who are very subscribed to physics, where there's a push-pull or a fulcrum, or any kind of very physical pressures and leverages and weights and so forth. So astrology transcends that because it is metaphysical. And so it gets into this archetypal blueprint principle, but still the main point is that and this is what we, lean on, is recognizing what synchronistic events are occurring. And the interpretation here is that, yes, these two unaspected planets represent sort of the old guard trying its best to overcome the flow of new energy coming in, but invariably not being able to. The forces of evolution were too strong. And so it created this whole new reality on the planet, which has been subsequently, uh, influenced and experienced all over the world in all kinds of ways, but the game remains afoot as, that monarchic power has shifted to private interests still, as with corporations and so forth. And so we can imagine that the great wealth of these great families have shifted away from being in a position of obvious authority and have probably taken up positions of more conservative power still, but not in the same way, at least. So that's the best thing about that. So yeah, the other main factor that with the moon there, with Mercury, just that they're unaspected, is something to notice. Now, I did mention that the sun here in Pisces, and the moon in Scorpio represent the water. And there's a lot of water in this chart. As a matter of fact, the whole chart signature is, as mentioned, Pisces. So that means we add up all the modalities and elements, and sure enough, yeah, Pisces is the mutable water sign. So the signature of the chart being Pisces is symbolic of, it's almost like Pisces being the sign of imagination and a collective mind. Very much the sign of the collective unconscious. So it was a time of a whole new envisioning a whole new reimagining of who we are and what the world could be was emerging. And that is indeed what has happened since the revolutions of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and those important philosophical books as well were contributing quite significantly in their own way to that whole perspective. So there's been this reimagining of who we are, and the subsignature being Aquarius itself, the planet that Uranus rules, plays a very key role in the whole story because, again, it represents the future and it points to themes of technology, but also on a social level of social change where democracy or the rights and freedoms of individuality take on a whole new emphasis, which wasn't there so strongly prior to that. It was, more de-emphasized, shall we say. We could, of course, notice that Neptune as well, the planet that rules Pisces, which is the chart signature, is technically what we call the planet of highest elevation. It's the closest planet to the midheaven. Whatever planet is closest to the midheaven in one's chart is known as the planet of highest elevation, and it takes on a prominent role. In Libra, which is all seeking, peace, seeking diplomacy, and especially because Venus rules Libra, and Venus, here it is, in Pisces. So we have this real strong Piscean theme, which again, I'm interpreting it as a reimagining of who we are and why we are and how we are and so forth. So now Venus in Pisces is a very lovely placement for Venus to be, and it really does speak of humanism and about being fair, as would be Venus itself is very much a planet in Pisces of compassion and kindness, etc. And spiritual love, agape is one of the words, but that it is disposited, or the planet that rules Pisces is Neptune in Libra's, the sign that rules Venus rules Libra. So there's a mutual reception between Venus and Neptune. Very lovely. And it just celebrates themes of justice and equality and fairness, which hasn't entirely been realized at the levels at which people would like it. We have reached peak points in history, but we're now experiencing a valley point. I think most people would agree we're in complicated territory right now. It's another story. The main thing is that it gave rise to this whole theme of, reimagining ourselves and coming to a new sense of what human dignity can look like, free of dogmatic, tyrannical, hierarchical control. And again, we haven't broken free of it entirely. And with us being in the dawning of the age of Aquarius, still the sunrise point, in my opinion, has not technically occurred. It happens really at the end of this decade, about 2030, in my view. And so we're still dealing with like a valley period in that whole light. Okay, so there's some insights about that. Now, it's in that regard, it's interesting that the nodal axis, the moon's nodes, this is the south node, this is the north node. You see they're exactly opposing at 5 degrees of Scorpio and Taurus, respectively, with the north node being like the pole of the future, being at the Taurus and building upon new foundations. And they are T square. That means the opposition is pointing by 90 degrees either way to Pluto in Aquarius. And especially Pluto in Aquarius in the third house lends to this whole idea of breaking free of old traditional ways of seeing the world, old traditional perspectives, self-concepts, interpretations. That's what the third house is very about. So this T square really was pushing people to break free of old dogmatic and traditional notions and to really embrace the future, which is very much about what Aquarius is symbolic of. So we come into this whole new breaking free with the Age of Enlightenment, following on the heels of the scientific revolution, and just the doors were just blown wide open, followed by the industrial revolutions, and a whole new world was birthed out of it, as we all know, and the world has and continues to significantly change, not the least of which is true attributed to modern science and specifically technology. Okay, because science is a word, but the technical engineering side of science, which some don't refer to as science. It's interesting, like there's science in engineering, but engineers would refer not to specifically refers to themselves as scientists, but as engineers, designers of new technologies, which has very significant association with Aquarius, the sign of invention and futurism and so on. So it all is very much in keeping, but we had to, and continue even to this day, to have to open our minds. And that's what Pluto in the third house is about. It kind of challenges us to wake up and break free of, again, old traditional notions of things, and to, we to this day continue to require a larger scope of awakening on the planet to many types of things, and we're getting there. It's the thanks in part, great part, to the internet. There's an awakening and a higher elevation of human intelligence and so forth, but there's, it's being worked out quite a bit on social media as people kind of confront each other with their various views and perspectives and beliefs, which they assumed to be objective, but they're more subjective. And it will never be a consensus, probably in an absolute sense, but it is helping at best that we're still in this wave of revolutionary consciousness. But it was very, very, if we think it's strong now, it was especially strong then. Okay, so people had various challenges with letting go of the notion that, the king and queen were the rulers, the monarchs, and it was opening the door to a whole new consideration, and probably not everybody was handling it very well. They liked kind of having that king and queen authority, and that, of course, tradition continues to this day, as with the royal family in England and many royal families in the world, still celebrated by some who look to them as, quasi leaders, even though modern constitutional laws have come in. And again, there's a revolutionary impulse still at play there. So the other T-square was to the sun itself from the Saturn-Mars conjunction, a very powerful conjunction all on its own, opposing Uranus and pointing to the sun. So it's interesting because they're in the sign of Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, which is playing a key role overall. It's because it's partially what we call stationary retrograde. So it was sort of at a relative standstill at the time of this discovery, which gives it a lot more power, like a planet that appears to be stopped due to the retrograde process and the fact that we're looking at the cosmos, the solar system, from a geocentric perspective, is what gave rise to that whole theme of what I mean is it's giving focus to this stationary planet. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. And a stationary planet can be said, like anything, to have more weight because it's apparently stopped. So anything of a weight factor in motion will feel lighter than if it's got no motion. It's in a complete state of stasis and inertia and weight that comes with that. So, so Jupiter playing a key role, and it is the planet of highest degree. So at the end of the day, it was contributing very much to a whole new confidence, that was emerging, and in this process of reimagining ourselves, we're coming to a whole new sense of identity. So strong has it emerged that the notion of returning to monarchist authority is just something that most people can't even understand. It's just something that it would require immense transformation. And if Aquarius and Uranus are going to do what they generally suggest, it's unlikely to happen. So what we are going to do, though, is we're still shifting out of that monarchist and monarchy oriented focus still to this day, 243 years later. But the old power is still there, but we see new power. There's people on the world stage who have acquired and earned and so forth great wealth. Of course, Elon Musk and Bill Gates and so on, people of that, and all kinds of celebrities, just immense wealth. So it really opened the gates for the average person to be able to rise, which is very much what we call the American dream at best. But it was a story. So this chart really illustrates rather generally this whole reimagining ourselves, a revolution coming to a new era, a new epoch, really, which we're still in and working out the details of. But at that time, with the American and the French revolutions in particular, and others that were inspired by those two, it's created a domino effect throughout the world ever since, and even, as I keep saying, continues to this day, because you have to really think at a very wide angle when you think of this large cycle. So 243 years in the bigger picture of history isn't really that long. Okay, it's long enough. Of course, it's not a short period of time, but it's not like when we think of ancient Greece or Rome or Egypt or anything. Well, we're talking about thousands of years, right? And so the ancient cultures, etc., which were there for so long, and they operated differently, and there was invariably a hierarchical rulership, whether with pharaohs or kings or other um, popes, and uh, this whole notion of hierarchical thinking still remains in various degrees, but if you look at the world, you can recognize it doesn't hold the same weight. And everybody to this day, many groups, people, individuals, etc., feel like it's absolutely their spiritual divine right to have authority to think for themselves and to act individually. And that's part of the whole revolution, I think, as well, because we have to find the middle point, the middle ground. So the irony is that too much individualism can create selfishness, and we're not really thinking in a whole humanity or whole even national way. And that has been an issue, and that's part of the whole story. So the fixed cross in this case, Scorpio here and Leo on the midheaven, those are fixed signs on the main four quarters, does show a lot of power drive. Fixed signs have a lot of gravity, you might say. They, out of the mutable, fixed, and uh, cardinal, fixed, and mutable modalities in astrology, you might say fixed have the most weight, the most torque. So having them on the angles really shows that it's a real heavy weight of force in this whole drive. Interestingly and ironically linked to Pisces, which is a very ephemeral kind of sign. It is the sign of oceans, however, so we can think of it at best like a tidal wave of new consciousness that has been coming in ever since. and the aftermath of that, and all in orientation to a whole new level of perception, a whole new self-concept of who we are, why we are, etc., has been, sparked, and we've removed the intermediaries of priestcraft or monarchs who were deemed historically to be closer to God, for example. So I think what's going to happen is it's already now and has been for some time, but will continue to give rise to a whole new spiritual science. Okay, it takes time to break free from the grip of the Roman Catholic Church, which is a very theocratic, politic and state religion. And we've come to a whole new driving force of consciousness of bringing the experiential approach to spirituality to the fore, and that's what would be called spiritual science. So this chart, especially with Pisces and as the signature and Aquarius as subsignature, represents spiritual science. And that's a big awakening that continues to unfold. And the more that what we're still getting there, we've been having to break free of the yoke of even other religious traditions and their various philosophies and dogmas that were, whether it was Hinduism or Buddhism or Christianity or Islam or etc. They all have their merits, but they at worst were hierarchical, and they were more belief driven often, not as much in the East, it's true. But even so, in the East, the dangers and the problems were that they removed themselves from society. So they became, more detached from the world. So the modern age now is asking us to become more spiritually aware, like with various forms of what would be called spiritual science, but to become more spiritual, but in the world, and to spiritualize society without having to make the dogmatic religion a part of the state. So we want to remove that. That's what I would call true. So it's very significant, and intuitively I'm picking that up. So let's look a little further, though. We've had a nice, good, long look at this chart. There's more to say, there always is. But for now, there's some insights for you, and I'm going to jump over to looking at, this is the Sabian symbol, specifically connected to Dane Ridyar's an astrological mandala, which is a unique interpretation of what's called the Sabian symbols. And what's important about that is that it is probably the best one. There's a few versions. People will have their different attractions to different interpretations of the Sabian symbols, which was originally, conceived, shall we say, by another astrologer, Mark Edmund Jones, who was a very gifted astrologer indeed. But there's reason to believe that Dane Ridyar had a larger vision, and he was able to really interpret them at another level, a whole other level of mastery. And some would argue that, but I would myself. So you could find for free online that book called an astrological mandala. That's what it looks like. Okay. And mindfire.ca, as simple as that. Just go mindfire.ca and you'll have a free digital version of that book. And I would encourage, though, if you really do get it, do take the time to read the introduction, which is quite in-depth, and the back of the book. Really understand the system before you dive in, because you may feel a little lost if you don't. Now, the main point is that right on the ascendant, which was 10 degrees, so in the way the Sabian symbols work, we would look at 11 Scorpio. It's 10 degrees in a certain amount of minutes. So we would look at the next degree, and it shows the image. Oh, it was also the beginning of a new round of series of 5, which you'll find in that book. And it was the individual mental. The previous cycle that it comes out of was called the emotional cultural. So it makes sense with the discovery of Uranus chart, the birth chart that it represents, is sort of a symbol of breaking free of that emotional cultural to the individual mental. And we remain in that momentum to this day, I would offer. So the image, and it's a Sabian symbol, is like a tarot card image of a symbolic image like of a drowning man being rescued. And the keynote is the deep concern of the social group for the safety of individuals. So in history, life was cheap. You were just a disposable entity in the minds of higher monarchists and even religious dogmatic authority. It was, remains at worst to that extent, but we've been progressively, slowly but surely raising the dignity of the individual because every person is a soul incarnate. So it goes on and reads, this symbol should be interpreted as revealing the basic feeling of relationship between the individual and his fellow man or persons, as would be appropriate in this modern age to use, not use the man version of that word too much. What is pictured is the expression of this relationship rather than the experience of the person who carelessly perhaps ventured too far beyond his depth and then was given a second chance to live. A man risks his life to save another. This is love based on a sense of responsibility produced by a vivid sense of interrelatedness. He goes on to say, sustained by this love, the individual may be more secure in venturing forth, but this insurance can also lead to unwarranted daring and trust. It's a good example, very good example of the very principles of Aquarius and the planet Uranus that rules it in this modern version of Western astrology in particular. And it's just that the individual, the notion of Aquarius is honoring the individual within the collective, but we want to honor that the individual in the collective also is responsible back to the collective. That's a kind of the hidden message there. Anyways, on the bottom, the footnote is, this is the first stage of the 45th sequence of bipolar phases. You'll read, it pictures the concern of the social whole for any one of its parts, all for one and one for all is the theme there. Even if this concern is merely the spontaneous act of rescue performed by a chance bystander, as the story of the image goes. The key word humanitarianism, thus displayed, has deep cultural roots, and that's the beauty of it. It's like and we still are working this to this day at really coming to a true embodiment of humanitarianism. So it's a wonderful consideration that, and I hope by sharing this, it might inspire that much more. So now the midheaven, which is the other main axis point, the duty of the chart, again, in the individual mental. So it's interesting how the two Sabian symbols match up that way so beautifully. And it shows after the heavy storm, a rainbow, the keynote interpretation, linking above and below the covenant with one's divine nature, promise of immortality. So it's really beautiful that the signature of the chart, Pisces, the spiritual sign of the whole zodiac, the mystical sign of the soul between lives, and it goes into all this deep, rich, mystical language when you understand Pisces well. And the Aquarian factor and Uranus is all about the awakening of that. So really, we might almost look at the discovery of Uranus as sort of a technological and materialistic perspective, but That was just the foundational, I would offer, aspects. Now that we've established modern technology and engineering and so forth, now with the leisure that it's affording us at best, but we still have some social political work to do there, clearly on a global level. But it at best will afford us more time and opportunity not to be living in endless survival. Okay, so that's the beauty of it. So it goes on and reads, in the Bible, the rainbow is the sign of the covenant established by God and Noah, the cyclic seed man. Rudyard goes on to emphasize, guaranteeing that no longer shall the destructive power of the spirit, the Shiva aspect of the divine, be used to destroy life on earth. Well, we don't know a lot about how true that is. But anyway, as it goes, it comes and says, as we come to the third level of the scene of release, we find the man or the person who has been able to weather the cathartic storm face to face with his divine archetype. That means really genuinely being awake in one's personal evolutionary process. And because he has been, or that person has been victorious, a link has been established with his divine soul. So it's a whole emphasis again on that spiritual theme I was mentioning. The symbol of the rainbow shows us the need to maintain a state of open communication between the sky and earth within our total being. Symbolic of astrology, by the way. So, Pisces and Aquarius are very strong signs in association with astrology. It generally is given to Aquarius as the sign of paradox and so forth, but the deeper mystical metaphysical principle is quite significantly Pisces as well, at least, if not more so. But the main point is this notion of the communication between sky and earth has a very strong astrological theme in it. So it goes on, it says, not for the sake of finding the ever elusive pot of gold, it more emphasizes the process of an evolutionary journey of the soul, which is interesting because in the chart, the moon was in Scorpio and the sun in Pisces, the two luminaries in the water signs, and Pisces and Scorpio at best together are themselves very alchemical. Scorpio being the sign of transformation, Pisces of the spiritual theme of that we really are souls incarnate, etc. So at the end of the rainbow, for this end is never to be reached, but in order to face the totality of our individual selfhood. So the main point it's trying to make is that there's a journey, a process. We are not out strictly solely as a species undergoing an evolutionary process. It's about us as individuals recognizing that we're evolving souls in the earth school is what I would offer. Now, at final words, after every successfully met crisis, the revelation of worth comes to us, and with it comes the promise of success if we do our part. So it's kind of symbolic of, as I was writing up here, that there's a purpose, there's a divine plan. Astrology shows this very strongly, that we are spiritual beings having human experiences, and we're here on purpose to evolve through the earth school. That understanding is so important, so significant to our collective need at this time, and it's giving rise to a spiritual scientific revolution. Okay, like in other words, spiritual science is the key of all of this, very significantly indicated by the fact that the signature of the chart is Pisces. It's important to note that Uranus was the first planet to be discovered followed by, the discovery of Neptune, then Pluto, then Chiron, and a whole asteroid belt of smaller planetary, players in the astrological pantheon, and then subsequently further planets like Eris and so forth that have also taken their place in the whole scheme of things. And we're going to talk about those another day. So there's just a little look at that this is just a final few words. We're looking at what's called the same chart, the discovery chart, but from a solar chart perspective. I call that sort of the left eye, and not to put a derogatory on left versus right, but the natal chart and what most Western astrologers use, the Placidus house cusp system. It has become popular to use whole signs, which is fine and good, but it's a more refined perspective to use the house cusp system like Placidus, I would say. And both can offer insights, but this is another version or another angle of the same chart, which is what we do when we don't know the birth chart, or excuse me, time. We don't know the time of birth of an individual. We'll cast what's called the solar chart, which is putting whole sign house cusps. Like if the sun is in Pisces, the ascendant becomes 0 Pisces. Okay, it's a little bit of a technique. You can look it up if you're so inclined. Solar charts. Okay, and again, very powerful, very useful. And what's significant about it, and I'm going to keep this short, in particular, is the planet Venus as the planet of lowest degree and on the ascendant very prominently, and Jupiter, the planet of highest degree, is holding that planet of highest elevation in accidental honor in the house it rules, the ninth house, and further holding honor in its conjunction with the midheaven in Sagittarius. So those two are playing a really beautiful key role, and it can basically be described as the need to recognize who we are. It's kind of a remembering, which is indicated in part with the Pisces rising sign by Neptune in the 8th house. The 8th house is a very deep house in astrology. It's the kind of the Scorpio in the 8th house represents the underground waters of the world. There's a lot of deep mystery in it. Neptune there is asking us to almost like reclaim our very deep old knowing that we had the ancients, like the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the Babylonians even, and the Indian and the Chinese of old were very deeply spiritual people. They were very, very interested in spiritual science. They weren't locked into dogmatic notions yet. It was part of their whole way of being without question. Okay, it was just a very matter-of-fact reality. So they definitely were much more deeply involved, but that wasn't necessarily all the people, but it was more widely accepted in those cultures to really revere the higher realities, where the scientific revolution at worst came in and wiped out all of that deep reverence and that deep communion with existence. It has served a role, and did by almost necessity install a materialistic paradigm, which I always refer to as the scaffolding of the building process that it needed to achieve the modern technological advances we have. But now that it's done that for all intents and purposes, we have all the foundational modern technology we need. We can go forward, but we don't, it's just elaborating upon what we've done in large measure. We can now get rid of the scaffolding. What that would equate to is, let's get rid of this silly notion of materialism, which emphasizes that life is just random and arbitrary without meaning. That's probably our demise. That's what's wrong with the world in large measure. So the whole idea of entering into a new spiritual awakening through a spiritual science, I keep saying that, which means you dive deeper into understanding the spiritual principles, but that's not commonly known even to this day, as people commonly adhere to either atheism at one negative pole or to religious belief dogma. Okay, they're more believing in hoping, as somebody referred to as a hopium, versus genuinely coming to knowledge and understanding and practice of various spiritual techniques. So each individual has their own experience of the mystic, which is what spiritual science basically is about on one hand, but it also refers back on a social cultural level to, as we develop that, to honoring that we are souls incarnate. That's one of its takeaways. And it also removes the priestcraft. No longer do we have to have monasteries and priestcrafts and intermediaries. We kind of can do away. Yes, there will always be some that are more committed or more evolved or wiser, and they become teachers. It's true, but they should and would invariably serve a more practical function in society and not be all, off in monastic living where they don't meaningfully contribute to the world. It becomes sort of a navel gazing thing at worst. So even though we can borrow from those traditional cultural religious setups with their techniques, we just want to take them out of the monasteries, aside from perhaps where we kind of go on retreats to monastic environments. That's different than becoming like a monk. Okay, there may be the few that will choose that path, but the more that people are invited and educated and inspired to have their own experience of their spiritual nature is the key in my view. And I believe that that's what that chart is quite significantly suggesting. This is actually a final look at what's called the heliocentric chart. The heliocentric chart is a whole different ballgame, but the astrology, all systems of astrology are geocentric because we live on this planet and we experience the planets and the sun and the moon orbiting us, even though we know the sun is at the center of the solar system. That's not our experiential reality. And that's that whole understanding that Kant was kind of challenging, and he introduced the notion of objective perception. But again, Einstein and that revolutionary movement says in modern science, it can't be done. Subjectivity and perception remain absolutely significant. So what we call objectivity is just more still subject to our own individual experiences of that objectivity. So I always like to say objectivity is the illusion we're sharing. It's a bit of a riddle of statement. But the main point of this is that the heliocentric chart can be understood as our collective unconscious mind. And, we won't go long into this because it's a whole different twist on things, because it's looking at the chart from from the sun's perspective. And this would be the symbol of the earth in Virgo. Okay. And that's what's interesting and significant about that is that in that particular place, it's at exactly that degree, it's inviting a whole new awakening, because it's in that exact degree. It's linked to Taurus and Gemini, and Venus, that is the Taurian ruler, is conjunct Pluto in Aquarius. So it's asking for, again, that principle of experiential awakening. Aquarius is very much about experiencing and experimenting. So that's one side of it. And interestingly enough, the other aspect, the dwad of that exact degree, is Gemini, ruled by Mercury in Cancer, which interestingly enough is very prominent in the chart just by virtue of being in exact square to Neptune. So ironically, and interestingly enough, you'll see it's at 4, Neptune's at 4, and Venus and Pluto are at 3 and 4, and Chiron's at 5. So they're really playing a really big role. And what this is basically suggesting, interestingly and ironically, Mercury in Cancer is trying to invite us back to our subjective experiential perspectives, to honor our own individual experiences, and of course that of others. So it's kind of bringing the person back into focus. Okay, so it's another phase of development. So those are some insights basically about this heliocentric chart. It really does, in my view, emphasize that, and especially also Mars conjunct Pluto, very alchemical. The alchemist here seeking the subjective experience, with Uranus at the planet of highest degree in the solar chart, asking for an awakening of consciousness, interestingly enough, which is the ruler of Aquarius, where you have Venus and Pluto conjunct. So yeah, it's a real celebration. And interesting, on a very final note, it's so interesting that Neptune, which is the ruling planet for Pisces, which is the signature of the geocentric chart, is the planet of highest elevation, right up there. And interestingly enough, in its decant and duad, it's in what's called the duad of Scorpio, it too lends to the alchemy. Alchemy being a very conscious, deliberate exercise of spiritual science to raise one's vibration, and yet in raising one's vibration, one becomes more present, not transcendent to the physical material world, but more embodied, but less attached, more in the flow of their spirit, less in their material attachment to their physical body as the ultimate expression of who they are, as opposed to the vehicle that the physical body is for the soul. And I think that's a very nice place to leave it with this whole theme and focus on Pisces. And it was really exciting and interesting to discover this deep spiritual message that comes out of the discovery of the planet Uranus 243 years ago. And again, it seems like a long time ago, but it's not really. And we're still in very significant key stages of its development. It was the planet that gave the rise to the awakening of the new age. And we've been establishing the ground of that possibility ever since, in very difficult ways. Revolutions of all kinds, from the scientific to, political, to the rise of constitutions. And, we continue now, but as would be the case, the tide, it's kind of a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back process sometimes. So we still have work to do to achieve that, but at least there's some inspiration here to consider that it's all part of our destiny to do it. And the discovery of the discovery of Uranus very significantly offers this perspective. So there you go, a little spring equinox gift for you, and for all of us to enjoy that whole awakening principle that is still happening in the bigger picture. But on this first day of spring 2024, it's a nice little celebration of astrology, because spring equinox is what we call International Astrology Day. So it is all in perfect keeping. So thank you for being here and listening. And thanks for leaving a comment or two about what you thought about what I just shared with you. And thanks for subscribing as well to my channel. Have yourself a great rest of the day and a wonderful spring 2024.